Okay, so imagine a global scorecard where the rules have been set in stone for, well, for over 30 years.
Right, a totally rigid system.
Yeah, exactly. And for decades, this West African nation, Togo, just sat near the absolute bottom of the scorecard, like 161st place out of 194 countries.
Which is, I mean, incredibly low on the ladder.
Right. So if you look at that ranking, you'd think the story was entirely written. But suddenly, the United Nations introduces this one single new variable into the math.
They adjust the score to account for the actual ecological strain a country puts on the Earth.
Yes. And overnight, in this new ranking, Togo skyrockets 31 places to 130th.
It's honestly the ultimate data mystery.
It really is.
Yeah.
And so today, we're asking the massive, kind of uncomfortable question hidden inside that statistical anomaly. Like, did Togo secretly figure out how to thrive in a way we just couldn't see?
Or is the industrialized world's entire definition of success actually just, a blueprint for planetary destruction?
Exactly. And for you listening, whether you're catching up on global economics for a meeting or you're just wildly curious about how the world actually works beneath the headlines, we are taking a massive deep dive today into a highly specific, totally fascinating case study.
We are. We're looking at this incredibly dense, curated 15-page analytical report. It's titled Togo and the Global Human Development Report.
And it is packed. I mean, it's got over 30 years of historical data stretching from 1990 all the way to 2023. The report actually opens with this visual that just grabs you. It's this super minimalist world map, and Togo is highlighted.
Oh yeah, that map is striking.
Right. On the left side, it says 161st place, but then on the right side, when you factor in this new metric, the planetary pressure, it says 130th.
It immediately highlights the core pain point we're discussing today. Because, I mean, a 31-place jump on a global index of this magnitude isn't just a rounding error.
No, not at all.
It is basically a mathematical earthquake. It forces us to ask whether the ladder of development we've been telling developing nations to climb for the last century is actually, well, leaning against the wrong wall entirely.
Yeah, that's such a good way to put it. And we're not just going to read you the numbers today. Our mission is to decode the actual mechanisms behind them.
Exactly. We have to look past the decimal points to find the human reality breathing underneath them, because progress is ultimately an illusion if it's built on a foundation of deep social inequality.
Or if it's financed by an ecological debt that can never be paid back. So we have this 31-place plot twist waiting for us. But before we can even begin to understand how the UN flipped the script, we have to understand the standard game being played.
Right. To understand the anomaly, you must deeply understand the norm. The granddaddy of all these metrics is the Human Development Index, or the HDI.
The classic scorecard.
Exactly. And the global picture here is important. Between 1990 and 2023, the global HDI grew from 0.60 to 0.756.
Okay, so that's a pretty solid jump.
It is. That's a 24.3% increase across the entire human population.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately because I don't want to just throw acronyms around. If you're listening, you might hear 0.756 and think, well, great, but what does that actually mean?
Right. It's just a decimal to most people.
Exactly. It's a number between 0 and 1, right?
Yep.
What is the HDI actually measuring to get that specific decimal?
That's an excellent question. For a long time, the world basically measured a country's success by its gross domestic product, its GDP. How much money was it moving around?
Just purely looking at the cash.
Right. But in 1990, the UN realized that money alone doesn't tell you if a human being is actually living a good life. So they created the HDI as a composite index. It measures 3 fundamental dimensions of human life:
Which are?
a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living.
Okay, so health, education, and income.
Precisely. It looks at life expectancy at birth for health. It looks at expected and mean years of schooling for education. And it looks at gross national income per capita for the standard of living.
Got it.
But, and this is crucial for understanding the math, it doesn't just average them out. The HDI is a geometric mean.
Wait, hold on. You're telling me it's not just a simple average. Like, I know what an average is, but what is a geometric mean? Why does the UN use that instead of just adding the 3 numbers up and dividing by 3?
It's actually a brilliant piece of statistical design. If you use a simple average, a country could theoretically have infinite wealth, but 0 healthcare and 0 schools.
And they'd still get a decent overall score because the money pulls the average up.
Exactly. A
Hmm.
geometric mean multiplies the three dimensions together and then takes the cube root. What that means in plain English is that poor performance in any single dimension acts as a heavy anchor.
Oh, I see. So it drives the whole score down.
You've got it. You cannot compensate for a lack of basic human health simply by having a lot of billionaires. It penalizes uneven development.
Wow. Okay, that makes perfect sense. It forces balanced development. So when we say the world grew to an HDI of 0.756 out of a possible perfect 1.0, what the UN is saying is that the average human being on Earth is operating at roughly 75.6% of their ideal potential.
Yes. And the 24.3% increase since 1990 is a story of steady, undeniable civilization-level progress. I mean, we've seen hundreds of millions of people lifted out of extreme poverty, diseases eradicated, literacy rates climbing.
Though looking at the chart here, there is a pretty noticeable dip between 2019 and 2020.
Ah, yes, the global shock of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
The pandemic disrupted all three dimensions simultaneously. I mean, schools closed, life expectancy took a hit, and economies contracted. But the overall 33-year trajectory remains robustly upward.
And the data shows Togo is on that upward trajectory too, right? Like they aren't just stagnating. The report notes Togo grew from a baseline HDI of 0.412 in 1990 to 0.571 in 2023.
They are climbing steadily. The line on the graph is definitely going up and to the right.
Okay, so that's the good news.
It is. But here is the critical context we have to establish before we move forward. While Togo is growing, the rest of the world is also growing. So the gap between Togo and the global average remains incredibly stubborn.
It's basically like running a marathon where the person in first place gets to ride a bicycle.
That is a very accurate way to look at it.
Right, because you can be running your absolute fastest, breaking your own personal records every single mile.
Yeah,
You were objectively doing better than you were at the starting line.
but the person on the bike is still pulling away from you.
Exactly. Togo has made huge strides, but in 2023, with their score of 0.571, they are still 0.185 points behind the global average.
Which means there is a massive deficit in reaching that ideal human potential. A Togolese citizen is operating at roughly 57% of what the UN considers the ideal maximum potential.
Whereas the global average is up near 76%.
Right.
Which brings us to the obvious question, like why? If they are climbing, why are they still 161st in the world? And the sources we have today don't just leave us with a broad, vague mystery.
No, they drill down into the exact mechanisms holding the country back.
Yeah, the data points directly to structural inequalities, starting with what has to be the most foundational building block of any modern economy: education.
If you want to understand why Togo is struggling to close that marathon gap, you have to look at their schools. Or, more accurately, you have to look at exactly who gets to stay in those schools and for how long.
Okay, let's get into it. The education metric within the HDI is split into two distinct parts, right?
Yes, expected years of schooling and mean years of schooling.
Let's start with expected years. This is looking at a child entering the school system today, correct? What does the system theoretically offer them?
That's right. In 2023, a young boy entering the education system in Togo can expect to receive 14.5 years of schooling.
14.5. Okay.
That gets him through primary, secondary, and a bit of higher education or vocational training. It's a solid foundation for entering a modernizing workforce.
But a young girl entering that exact same system can expect only 12.9 years.
Yes.
So right off the bat, there's a 1.6-year gap at the very starting line of life. Now, if you're listening to this in the US or Europe, you might be thinking, well, 1.6 years doesn't sound world-ending. Maybe she just skips a few elective courses or doesn't do a master's degree.
But we have to realize what those specific 1.6 years represent in a developing economy.
Exactly. What do they represent?
This is where we need to look at the mechanism of education. Think of the education system in a developing nation like a three-stage rocket.
Okay, I like this analogy.
The primary school years, learning to read, write, and do basic arithmetic, that is the launch pad. It gets you off the ground. But in Togo, for young women, the second stage detaches prematurely.
Oh, wow.
Those 1.6 years are almost always lost in mid to late adolescence. It is the difference between dropping out before finishing high school versus going on to get a diploma or a secondary qualification.
So they're falling back to Earth right at the exact moment they need to be reaching orbit. Because those last 2 years of secondary school aren't about learning basic spelling. That's where you learn complex, specialized skills.
Exactly. It's where you learn the foundational science for nursing, or the complex mathematics for accounting, or the organizational skills to manage a logistics business.
Right. And if you lose those years, you lose the ability to participate in the formal, specialized economy. You are basically locked out.
You are. And the long-term compounding effect of that 1.6-year expected gap shows up brutally in the second education metric, the mean years of schooling.
Mean years looks backward, right? Like it looks at the adult population, people 25 and older, and asks, okay, how much education did you actually get when you were young?
Yes. And the statistic here is one of the most sobering in the entire 15-page report. An adult woman in Togo today has, on average, only 4.5 years of formal education.
4.5 years. I literally stopped reading and just stared at the page when I saw that. 4.5 years.
It's hard to process.
If you're listening, think about what you were learning in the 4th or 5th grade. That is the average educational ceiling for half of the adult population in the country.
And if you look at the visual they provide for this, it's quite stark. They use these pencil graphics to represent the years of schooling.
Yeah, I'm looking at that right now. The pencil for a woman in Togo is broken like almost completely in half compared to the global average.
Because the global average for adult women is 8.4 years of schooling. So Togo's women are operating with only 53.5% of the educational baseline that the rest of the world's women possess.
Okay, I want to challenge this for a second just to play devil's advocate. Some people might argue, well, 4.5 years is still basic literacy. They can read, they can do math. Why does it crater the country's HDI so badly?
Right. Why does it matter so much on a macro level?
Exactly. How does an individual woman's 4.5-year education cap translate into a macroeconomic crisis for the whole nation?
That is the essential question. The economic literature is crystal clear on the mechanism here. Lost years of education for women actively cripple a nation's macroeconomic trajectory.
Because if half your workforce is capped at a 4th grade education, you simply cannot diversify your economy.
Precisely. You don't have the human capital. You
Sure.
cannot build a domestic tech sector. You cannot build advanced manufacturing.
You probably can't even modernize your agricultural sector with advanced agronomy, right? Because the workforce lacks the foundational scientific literacy to implement those systems at scale.
Exactly. You are locked into subsistence agriculture or low-skill, informal labor. The entire nation's GDP ceiling is artificially lowered.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, we look at those 4.5 years not just as a statistic, but as an economic anchor. It explains so much.
But the report goes further. It says maternal education isn't just about jobs. It's literally a matter of life and death.
Wait, really? How direct is that link?
Extremely direct. Maternal education is widely recognized as the single strongest predictor of infant survival rates. A mother with secondary education is significantly more likely to understand basic hygiene, to understand modern nutrition.
And most importantly, to know exactly when to seek medical intervention for a sick child, rather than relying on traditional, sometimes ineffective remedies.
Yes. When a society deprives women of those crucial years of secondary schooling, it is simultaneously stalling its economy and actively endangering its next generation.
Which provides the perfect, albeit grim, transition into the health dimension of the HDI. Because if education is the foundation of the economy, health is the foundation of existence. And the data here in the Togo report offers a really cruel paradox.
It does. It requires us to look at two different metrics that seem to be telling completely opposite stories. On the surface, if you just look at the top-line number for health overall life expectancy, things look incredibly promising.
Right, let's look at the positive side first. In terms of life expectancy, Togo has made very real, highly commendable strides since this data started being tracked.
In 1990, the average life expectancy at birth was only 54.6 years. But by 2023, it jumped to 62.7 years.
That is an 8.1-year increase in the average lifespan of a citizen over a little more than 3 decades. It is a massive triumph for basic public health.
It really is. The global average in 2023 is 73.4 years. So Togo has managed to shrink the gap between themselves and the rest of the world to just 10.7 years.
It proves that whatever investments they are making, like, clean water initiatives, basic childhood vaccines, anti-malarial bed nets, they are fundamentally working. The baseline survival rate of the population has drastically improved. People are living longer.
However, underneath that rising life expectancy curve hides a devastating secondary statistic. And it is a statistic that specifically impacts women. We are talking about the maternal mortality ratio, or the MMR.
Okay, define MMR for us. What exactly is this measuring?
The maternal mortality ratio measures how many women die from pregnancy-related causes per 100,000 live births. It is one of the most sensitive indicators of a health system's true resilience.
And the numbers in Togo are jarring. In 2023, Togo saw 399 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births. 399.
To put that in perspective, the global average is 216.
Which means the physical act of bringing new life into the world in Togo is nearly 1.5 times deadlier than the global average.
It is a staggering difference.
Wait, hold on. I have to push back on this because the math feels completely contradictory. You're telling me Togo's overall life expectancy jumped by 8 years, but maternal mortality is still hovering up near 400. How is that mathematically possible? Like, if mothers are dying at that catastrophic rate, shouldn't the overall average life expectancy of the country be tanking?
It's a brilliant observation, and it highlights the paradox of uneven development. Think about how you raise life expectancy. The easiest, most cost-effective way to drastically raise the average lifespan of a population is to stop children from dying before the age of 5.
Oh, because mathematically, an infant death pulls the statistical average down much harder than an adult death.
Exactly. So a country like Togo runs massive, highly successful public health campaigns. They distribute polio vaccines, measles vaccines, and malaria treatments.
Which are relatively cheap, easy to transport, and can be administered by healthcare workers with minimal training. The infant mortality rate drops, and the overall life expectancy shoots up.
Right. So like fixing all the smoke alarms in a house. It absolutely saves lives.
Yes, but fixing the smoke alarms doesn't put out a blazing fire in the kitchen.
That's it exactly. Maternal health is the kitchen fire. You cannot solve maternal mortality with a simple vaccine drive once a year. Maternal survival requires a deeply complex, highly resilient, continuously functioning infrastructure.
Because childbirth emergencies are unpredictable, right? They require immediate high-level intervention.
Precisely. To lower the MMR, you need trained, certified midwives available in rural villages. You need sterile surgical theaters ready for emergency C-sections 24/7.
You need reliable cold storage for blood banks to treat postpartum hemorrhages.
And perhaps most fundamentally, you need a physical road network that is paved and maintained so that a woman in obstructed labor can actually reach that surgical theater before it is too late.
Right. It requires a system that works flawlessly every single day, not just on a designated public health holiday. And that requires massive, sustained capital investment, which we'll get to the money in a minute.
We will. But before we do, we have to talk about the human fallout. Because a maternal mortality rate of 399 isn't just a tragedy for the women who die. It is a societal earthquake.
Yeah, let's unpack that. What does that actually do to a community?
We cannot understate the deep cascading trauma caused by this high rate. When a mother dies in childbirth, it fundamentally destabilizes the entire family unit.
The surviving newborn, if they survive the birth, has a drastically reduced chance of living past their first birthday without their mother's milk and immediate care.
Exactly. And it ripples out to the older children, too. Extremely so. When the mother is gone, the household loses a primary caregiver and often a primary economic contributor.
So what happens next?
The older siblings are frequently pulled out of school to take over the caregiving duties for the younger children. And sociologically, the children pulled out of school to do domestic labor are almost always the older girls.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see the connection now. That feeds right back into the broken education system we were just talking about.
Yeah.
The 1.6-year gap in expected schooling.
Yes, and the 4.5-year cap on mean schooling. It's a domino effect. One structural failure, the lack of maternal health care, knocks down the education goals for the next generation.
It is an interconnected web. High maternal mortality actively destroys the very human development that the HDI is attempting to measure. It removes caregivers, it removes economic contributors, and it perpetuates a cycle of survival mode living rather than developmental progress.
It becomes incredibly obvious that you can't just fix one thing.
But, I mean, to build those surgical theaters, to buy the refrigerators for the blood banks, to pave the rural roads, and to keep those girls in school, a country needs resources. They need capital.
They do. So we have to turn to the third dimension of the HDI. We have to look at Togo's economic engine. What does the income data tell us?
The economic data is where the gap between Togo and the rest of the world stops looking like a marathon and starts looking like a vast, gaping gulf. The metric used by the UN here is gross national income per capita, or GNIPC.
And crucially, it is measured in purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Okay, let's slow down and define PPP for the listener. Because if we just use raw exchange rates, the numbers get totally distorted, right?
Very distorted. If I tell you someone makes $2,000 a year, you might think they're starving in the streets because in New York or London, $2,000 barely covers 1 month of rent.
Right.
Purchasing power parity is an equalizer. It adjusts the income data to account for the local cost of living. It asks, how much actual stuff, food, shelter, basic goods can this amount of money buy in this specific country? It gives us a true apples-to-apples comparison of global living standards.
Okay, so knowing that the numbers have already been adjusted to reflect real-world buying power, what are the numbers?
In 2023, the global average GNI per capita was $20,327.
Okay, about $20,000 purchasing power for the average global citizen.
Yes. Togo's GNI per capita was a mere $2,856.
$2,856 a year. That means Togo is surviving on just 14% of the global average income.
14%.
When a national economy is operating on a margin that thin, every single government expenditure becomes a brutal zero-sum game.
It does. It forces impossible choices on policymakers.
Yeah.
I mean, do you pave the road to the rural hospital, or do you buy textbooks for the secondary school? Do you invest in the agricultural supply chain, or do you build a water treatment plant?
You literally can't do both. The economic foundation is simply too thin to support the broad-based human development they need. But here's where the UN report gets incredibly granular and honestly a bit dark.
Because it doesn't just stop at that national average, and we all know averages can be incredibly deceiving.
Averages hide the extremes. An average hides the billionaires living in gated compounds, and it hides the extreme poverty in the remote villages.
To account for this, the UN introduces a modified metric called the inequality-adjusted HDI, or the IHDI.
I love this metric because it forces us to be honest about the reality on the ground. The standard HDI gives you a score and says, here is your national potential.
But the IHDI comes in and says, okay, sure, that's your average potential, but how much of that development is actually reaching the everyday person? How much is being lost because the resources are hoarded?
Exactly. The IHDI reveals the true cost of a country's wealth and resource distribution. It measures the loss in potential human development due to inequality.
Globally, inequality costs the world 21.9% of its potential human development. In other words, if resources were distributed perfectly equally across the global HDI would be about 22% higher.
Which is already a massive, tragic loss of human potential on a planetary scale. But what happens when we look at Togo's penalty?
In Togo, inequality eats up a staggering 36.4% of its development potential.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because the report breaks down exactly which specific type of inequality is doing the most damage. It's not unequal access to education. It's not unequal access to life expectancy.
No, it is strictly the money. Income inequality alone causes a 44.1% loss in development potential for Togo.
Let that specific number sink in. The money Togo does have, that already tiny, fragile $2,856 per capita we just talked about, is not circulating evenly through the economy. It is highly siloed.
What does that actually look like in practice, though? How does money get siloed in a developing nation?
Well, it often looks like extreme geographic and class-based concentration. The wealth might be isolated in certain urban centers, like the capital city of Lomé, driven by port commerce or specific export industries.
Meanwhile, the rural populations, which make up a massive percentage of the country, remain entirely disconnected from that wealth, locked into subsistence farming.
It's basically an inequality tax. The country is already operating at 14% of the global income average, and the wealth distribution is heavily taxing its own ability to develop further.
Think about it like a water supply. If you have a tiny reservoir of water, but you use it all to fill one giant swimming pool in the capital city, the crops out in the country are going to die.
Exactly. That siloed money is exactly why the maternal wards aren't getting built and the girls aren't finishing school. The capital isn't reaching the infrastructure.
And historically, wealth concentration almost always results in a severe lack of political will to fund broad public infrastructure. If the wealthiest citizens, the decision makers, can afford private clinics and private tutors for their own children, the public systems are left to atrophy.
There is no internal pressure from the top to fix the bottom. Okay, so we know the wealth is incredibly unequal, but the sources are crystal clear about who is bearing the absolute brunt of this inequality.
It's not just an urban versus rural divide. It is a profound structural gender divide. It is the women and girls of Togo who are paying the highest price for this siloed economy.
We can track this systemic disadvantage through two highly specific indices the UN uses: the Gender Development Index, or GDI, and the Gender Inequality Index, or GII.
Let's start with the GDI, which essentially takes the HDI formula we've been talking about and calculates it separately for men and women, then compares the two.
And the comparison is stark. Togo ranks 176 out of 194 countries on the GDI. That lands them in what the UN specifically classifies as Group 5.
Group 5 is the absolute highest, most severe tier of gender inequality on the planet. The HDI value for women in Togo is a dismal 0.535, while for men it is 0.618.
The gap between 0.535 and 0.618 means that men and women in the same country are operating at a fundamentally different level of societal privilege, economic access, and bodily autonomy.
But the why is what we really need to investigate. Why is that gap so deeply entrenched?
Right. What is the actual mechanism keeping women trapped at that 0.535 level?
The second index, the Gender Inequality Index, gives us the exact mechanism. Togo's GII is 0.564, which indicates a very high level of inequality.
And when you look at the submetrics that make up that GII score, one number screams off the page. It is the primary driver of the inequality: the adolescent birth rate.
This is the statistic that ties the entire first half of our deep dive together into one devastating knot. The adolescent birth rate in Togo is 77.1 births per 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19.
To contextualize that, the global average is 39.1. Togo's rate of teenage pregnancy is nearly double the global norm.
If you're listening, I want you to really think about how we view this statistic, because we can't just look at 77.1 as a number on a public health spreadsheet.
It isn't just a data point. It is a biological and sociological mechanism of poverty. It is the trapdoor.
This raises an important question. How does this mechanism actually perpetuate the cycle? Let's trace the reality of that number. When a 15 or 16-year-old girl becomes pregnant in a developing societal structure like Togo's, the cultural norms almost uniformly dictate that she leaves the formal school system.
Ah, the rocket's second stage detaches. There is your 1.6-year gap in expected schooling.
Exactly. And once she is out of the school system, particularly with a newborn to care for, she rarely, if ever, returns. Because she didn't finish her secondary education, her specialized skills are permanently capped.
There is your 4.5 years of mean adult schooling.
And because her skills are capped at a 4th or 5th grade level, she cannot enter the formal, higher-paying labor market. She cannot become an accountant or a nurse or civil servant. She is relegated to the informal economy.
Okay, let's define the informal economy, because that's a term economists use a lot. What is she actually doing to survive?
She is engaged in street vending, selling small goods in local markets. She's doing unregulated domestic work. Or she is engaged in subsistence farming.
This labor is highly precarious. It offers absolutely no social protections or health insurance, and it pays a microscopic fraction of the wages found in the formal sector.
And there is your 44.1% income inequality loss. She is permanently locked out of the wealth silos.
And the final piece of the loop. Because she is poor, uneducated, working in the informal sector, and now a very young mother, her physical health risks skyrocket. Her body is often not fully developed enough for safe childbirth, and she lacks the economic means to access whatever maternal health care does exist.
The health risks for her child also skyrocket.
And there is your 399 maternal mortality rate. It is a perfectly closed, devastatingly efficient, self-replicating loop of disadvantage.
And the UN has a very specific way of measuring the ultimate outcome of this loop. They use the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the MPI.
The MPI. This is a fascinating metric because it admits that money isn't everything.
Exactly. The MPI looks beyond just the dollars in your pocket. It looks at overlapping non-monetary deprivations at the household level. It recognizes that poverty is an experience, not just an income bracket.
It asks the practical questions, like, do you have a dirt floor? Do you lack clean cooking fuel, meaning you're breathing in toxic smoke every time you make dinner? Are you undernourished? Do you lack basic sanitation?
Yes. And in Togo, the MPI reveals that 37.6% of the population lives in this state of multidimensional poverty. But here's the most revealing part of the data.
What's that?
The biggest contributors to that poverty aren't actually a lack of cash or assets. The highest contributors are a lack of education, which accounts for 17.7% of the poverty score, and a lack of nutrition at 16.4%.
It proves mathematically what we've been discussing conceptually. You cannot just drop a massive bag of cash into an economy and expect human development to magically occur.
If you don't break the sociological loop, if you don't keep that 16-year-old girl in school, if you don't provide her with reproductive autonomy, the poverty will continually regenerate itself generation after generation, regardless of the national GDP.
So we have spent the last 40 minutes painting a rather grim, albeit deeply realistic picture of Togo's struggle with traditional development metrics. They are trailing the world massively in income. They are battling severe gender inequality. Their education system is bleeding female talent, and their maternal health infrastructure is under immense strain.
Honestly, if our deep dive ended right here, the story would be a familiar, somewhat depressing one. Togo is 161st in the world, and they have a long, painful, uphill mountain to climb just to reach the global average.
But we promised you a plot twist, a massive paradigm-shifting anomaly, and it all centers around that final index we mentioned at the very beginning of the show.
Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
The PHDI. This is where we return to our opening mystery. How does a country sitting at the absolute bottom of the development ladder suddenly jump 31 places up to 130th?
To understand the PHDI, you have to understand a fundamental, increasingly loud critique of the traditional HDI that we've been using as our baseline today. For 30 years, the UN defined a highly developed nation as one with great schools, long life expectancies, and massive, roaring economic engines.
Think of Norway, the United States, Germany, or Australia, the gold standards, the countries everyone else is supposedly trying to emulate.
Exactly. But starting recently, ecologists, climate scientists, and forward-thinking economists began pointing out a glaring existential flaw in the math. Those gold standard nations achieved their incredible success by burning staggering amounts of fossil fuels and extracting deeply unsustainable levels of natural resources from the Earth.
They essentially built their beautiful, highly developed utopias by borrowing heavily against the ecological future of the entire planet.
Precisely. They took out an ecological loan, and the traditional HDI completely ignored the debt.
It's like judging the success of a massive corporation by looking strictly at its record-breaking revenue, throwing a huge party for the CEO, but completely ignoring the fact that the CEO is secretly embezzling billions of dollars from the employee pension fund to pay for it all. Eventually, the bill comes due. The system collapses.
That is a perfect analogy. So, to correct this massive blind spot, the UN created the PHDI. It takes a country's traditional standard HDI score and discounts it.
It mathematically penalizes the country based on two specific planetary pressures: its carbon dioxide footprint per capita and its material footprint per capita.
And when you apply that ecological penalty to the global scoreboard, everything we thought we knew completely flips upside down. The data here is absolutely wild. Let's look specifically at the carbon footprint metric. The global average carbon dioxide emission is 4.54 tons per capita per year.
That's 4.54 tons of carbon for every man, woman, and child on Earth on average. And in the highly developed industrialized nations, the ones at the very top of the traditional HDI, that number is vastly higher.
It could be 10, 15, even 20 tons per person per year, driven by massive grid power, internal combustion engines, industrial agriculture, and heavy manufacturing.
Now look at Togo. Togo's carbon emission is a microscopic 0.29 tons per capita. 0.29.
It is practically a rounding error on the global scale. It represents a society that is not burning massive amounts of coal, oil, or gas to survive.
So watch what happens to the math. When the UN calculates the penalty for planetary pressures, the global average HDI is slashed by about 10%. The rich, highly developed nations take a massive, brutal hit to their scores because their ecological strain is so incredibly severe.
The math finally recognizes their embezzlement from the Planetary Pension Fund.
But Togo, with its incredibly light, barely their footprint of 0.29 tons, is penalized only 1.6%. Their score remains practically untouched.
And that is how you jump 31 places. The countries above you collapse under the weight of their own ecological penalties, and Togo simply floats upward.
So, what does this all mean for us, for the listener? Does it mean Togo is actually a green, sustainable utopia and we should all be copying them?
I don't think it's quite that simple.
No, I don't either. But the irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. Rich nations look highly developed on paper, but they've guaranteed the destabilization of the global climate to get there. Togo hasn't taken out that toxic loan.
It forces me to ask, is it even fair or intellectually honest to call high-emitting countries developed if their entire economic model guarantees the eventual destruction of the planet? If the system destroys its own host, is it a successful system?
This is the philosophical weight of the data that I find so incredibly compelling, and it's why this 15-page report is so important. The PHDI forces us to redefine the very word progress.
It suggests that perhaps the traditional ladder of development, the one where you start as an agrarian society, industrialize heavily, burn millions of tons of coal, pollute your rivers, get extremely rich, and then try to use that wealth to clean up the environment later, is a fundamentally broken, suicidal model.
The classic pollute first, clean up later path of the West. It worked for a century, but the atmosphere is full now. We can't do it anymore.
Exactly. Togo is currently sitting at the bottom of that traditional ladder.
Mm-hmm.
But because they haven't industrialized in that dirty, extractive way, they inadvertently possess a massive ecological advantage.
They aren't locked into trillions of dollars of sunk costs in fossil fuel infrastructure. They don't have a massive political lobby trying to protect coal plants. They don't have to tear down old, dirty grids. They simply don't have them yet.
They are essentially a blank slate. They hold the high ground in the green economy. When we look at that 31-place jump, it isn't just a statistical quirk or a UN math trick.
It is the hard data telling us that Togo's baseline model of existence, purely from a planetary survival standpoint, is vastly more sustainable than the American, European, or Chinese model.
It's like they skipped the toxic middle step of the 20th century entirely. But, and this is a massive, incredibly important but that we need to acknowledge, you have to be careful not to romanticize this.
Because as we spent the first 40 minutes painstakingly discussing, their light carbon footprint isn't the result of high-tech solar panels, advanced wind farms, and a highly conscious, eco-friendly consumer base. It's largely the result of crushing multidimensional poverty.
That is the essential caveat, and it is the crux of the global development challenge. A low carbon footprint born from a lack of basic electricity, a lack of paved roads, and a reliance on subsistence farming is not the goal. Poverty is not an ecological solution.
The goal is a low carbon footprint combined with high human development. And bringing all of these disparate data points together, the struggles with the standard HDI and the triumph of the PHDI, gives us a very clear data-driven roadmap for how a country like Togo can actually forge that new path forward.
Let's do a rapid-fire summary of the final tally for you listening, just to set the board one last time before we look at the solutions. Togo currently trails the world in standard HDI, sitting at 0.571 against the global 0.756.
They trail massively in income, with a GNI per capita of $2,856 against $20,327.
And they were fighting a severe structural deficit in gender equality, with a GII of 0.564 against the global 0.455.
But they absolutely dominate the world in low-carbon emissions, outputting just 0.29 tons compared to the world's 4.54 tons.
Looking at that specific matrix of strengths and weaknesses, the analytical report suggests a focused three-point roadmap for Togo's future. It outlines how they can move from the valley of inequality up to the green high ground. Number one, and this is the absolute prerequisite for everything else, they must bridge the gender gap.
Everything else is secondary to this. Fix the 1.6-year education gap. Keep adolescent girls in school. Prevent early pregnancies by lowering that 77.1 birth rate.
Because if you can move the average schooling for women from 4.5 years up to 8 or 9 years, you instantly, fundamentally unlock half your entire population's economic potential.
Exactly. You convert informal subsistence laborers into formal, skilled contributors. Point 2. Fortify basic health care. with an absolute laser focus on the maternal mortality rate.
399 deaths per 100,000 births is an anchor dragging down the entire society. Building rural clinics, training midwives, securing blood bank cold storage, and ensuring safe deliveries is the fastest way to stabilize the core family unit.
And ensure the next generation actually survives to reach those newly fortified schools. Fix the fire in the kitchen, not just the smoke alarms. Don't just settle for higher overall life expectancy if the mothers are still dying. And point three.
Point three is where they use their plot twist. They must leverage their low-carbon advantage. Instead of trying to copy the 20th century Western model of development, begging for investments in coal plants or heavy polluting industries, Togo needs to aggressively attract 21st century green investments.
They have the rare opportunity to build their national grid on renewables like solar and wind from day one. They can prove to the world that a country can grow its economy, educate its girls, and save its mothers without burning fossil fuels to do it.
They can become the prototype for the future. True progress isn't just about stacking up GDP numbers on a spreadsheet so you can brag at the UN Assembly.
It's about ensuring that every single citizen, regardless of their gender, has the fundamental structural right to develop their potential while simultaneously keeping the planet habitable for the generation that comes next.
Which leaves us with a provocative thought, something not explicitly written in the UN text, but built entirely upon the data we've explored today. Right now, in 2026, we view Togo's light carbon footprint mostly as an accidental byproduct of their poverty. We look down from the top of the HDI rankings with a mix of pity and developmental superiority.
But what happens in the future?
What if, 50 years from now, as severe climate change increasingly ravages the industrialized world, flooding those wealthy coastal cities, permanently disrupting those massive agricultural belts, forcing mass climate migration, we look back at the historical data.
What if we realize that the traditional Human Development Index, the scoreboard we worshiped for decades, was actually a self-destruction
Oh,
index?
wow. A self-destruction index. The higher you score, the more carbon you burn, the faster you're bringing about your own ruin.
What if countries like Togo, who are sitting today at the so-called bottom of the ladder, but who have the rare opportunity to build renewable, sustainable, and equitable infrastructures entirely from scratch? What if they are actually the ones holding the blueprint for the real future of human development?
That is a thought to keep you up at night. The map isn't the territory, and the scorecard is only as good as the game you're playing.
Next time you look at a global ranking, remember to ask yourself, who made the rules? What is the exact mechanism they are measuring? And most importantly, what are they leaving out? Thank you to you, our listener, for coming along on this deep dive into the numbers with us. Keep questioning the metrics of success you see in the news every day. We'll catch you next time.